You don't feel exhausted because you're doing too much. That's the explanation people accept because it's polite. It makes your fatigue sound like a scheduling problem. It turns a deep psychological condition into a calendar issue. It lets everyone keep the same story. Life is hard. Everyone is busy. Try to rest more. But the exhaustion you're describing is not the exhaustion of effort. It's the exhaustion of performing a moral identity, a specific kind of goodness, not kindness, not integrity, not genuine care, something quieter, the version of goodness that makes you acceptable, the version that keeps you included, the version that keeps other people calm, the version that asks you to be smaller than you are. And if you're honest, the strangest part is this: even when you do rest, you don't recover. You lie down and your body is still tense. You take a day off and your mind keeps running. You finally get time alone and you don't feel peace. You feel accused, as if the moment you stop being useful, something in you starts building a case. That feeling is not weakness, it's conditioning. And Nietzsche would recognize it immediately, because Nietzsche was not interested in bad people. He was interested in how people become tired without understanding why, how they become obedient without realizing it, how morality, especially morality that calls itself virtue, can become a mechanism that turns life against itself. This channel doesn't teach, it reveals. And what this video reveals is uncomfortable. Some people are not exhausted by life, they're exhausted by being good. Because being good has stopped being a value, it has become a role. And roles cost energy, especially roles that require you to swallow your instincts, especially roles that require you to stay non-threatening, especially roles that require you to constantly prove you deserve your place. So let's start with something that looks normal. You're in a room with people, maybe friends, maybe family, maybe coworkers. Someone says something that bothers you. Not a big insult, not a dramatic betrayal, something small, a dismissal, a subtle disrespect, a selfish assumption, and you feel the impulse. You feel the heat rise. You feel the truth in your throat. You could speak. You could say, no. You could say, that doesn't work for me. You could say, stop. But you don't. You smile slightly. You soften your voice. You choose the safest sentence, and you tell yourself it's maturity. You tell yourself it's emotional intelligence. You tell yourself you're choosing peace. But later, you feel heavy, not because you avoided conflict, because you betrayed something inside you. And you don't call it betrayal, you call it being good. This is where the dynamic begins, because the exhausting part isn't that you care. The exhausting part is that your care has become compulsory. You don't give because you want to give, you give because not giving feels wrong. You reply because not replying feels guilty. You help because not helping feels selfish. You stay available because disappearing feels cruel. And that moral pressure is not neutral, it's a system that trains you to experience your own boundaries as a moral failure. Nietzsche would call this a spiritual technology, not in a mystical sense, in a psychological sense. A structure of values that shapes your instincts into obedience. And the most dangerous part is that it feels like virtue. So you defend it. You protect the very thing that is draining you, because you've built your identity on it. If you stop being good, who are you? That is the question your nervous system is answering every day. Not consciously, physiologically. Your body knows, if I stop being good, I risk losing love. I risk losing safety. I risk losing belonging. So it maintains the role. And the cost shows up as exhaustion. This is why your fatigue doesn't feel like tired muscles. It feels like drained will, like you have no appetite for life. And then you start looking for explanations. You say you're burned out. You say you're depressed. You say you're overwhelmed. Those words might be true on the surface, but Nietzsche would demand a sharper diagnosis. What are you exhausted from obeying? Because exhaustion is often the result of a life lived under an internal court, an invisible tribunal that never stops evaluating you. And that court has a single obsession. Are you good enough to be allowed? Allowed to rest, allowed to want, allowed to choose, allowed to take up space. So you develop a certain kind of goodness, a goodness that isn't about ethics, it's about permission. You become the person who earns their right to exist by being useful. And that is a form of slavery. Not slavery forced from outside, slavery installed inside you. This is why Nietzsche is dangerous, because he doesn't just criticize morality, he asks where morality came from and what it does to the body. He noticed something most people miss. Many moral ideals are not designed to make you noble. They are designed to make you manageable, to make you predictable, to make you non-threatening. So you internalize them and then you call them my values. But are they yours, or are they the values that made you acceptable? Because there's a difference. Real values give you strength. Inherited moral rules often give you guilt. And guilt is expensive. It costs energy every time you breathe. Now look at the daily shape of your life. You say yes when you mean maybe. You say maybe when you mean no. You apologize for existing. You soften your needs. You minimize your feelings. You make your desires sound reasonable, modest, respectable. You don't ask for what you want. You negotiate for what you're allowed to want. And you think that's humility. But humility becomes poison when it's not chosen, when it's enforced. Because enforced humility is not a virtue, it's self-erasure. And self-erasure is exhausting. Not immediately, slowly. You can do it for years, because society rewards it. People praise you, you're so kind, you're so reliable, you're so mature, you never cause problems. But each compliment is also a leash, because what they're praising is not your humanity, they're praising your compliance. They're praising how easy you are to have around. And if you've been starving for approval, you accept the leash, you accept it willingly, and then you wonder why you feel drained. Nietzsche would say, because your goodness is a bargain. You trade your instincts for acceptance. You trade your intensity for love. You trade your truth for peace. And every trade creates a debt. Not a financial debt, a psychological debt. You owe your life to the identity you've created. So you keep paying, you keep being good, until you become tired in a way sleep cannot fix. Now here's where it becomes even more uncomfortable, because the exhaustion isn't just fatigue, it often becomes resentment. But not the kind of resentment people confess, not loud anger, not obvious bitterness, a polite resentment, a resentment that hides behind kindness. You keep helping, but you feel something tightening inside. You keep giving, but you notice you're colder. You keep being available, but you start fantasizing about disappearing. You start imagining a life where no one can reach you, and then you feel guilty for imagining it. That guilt is the system protecting itself, because the system knows if you stop being good, you become dangerous. Not violent, dangerous in the Nietzschean sense. You become ungovernable. You stop being easily used. You stop being easily predicted. You stop being controlled by the fear of being seen as selfish. And the people around you, sometimes without malice, benefit from your goodness. So your body absorbs the cost, and you call it exhaustion. But exhaustion is a symptom. The disease is moral coercion, and it expresses itself in a very specific way. You feel guilty before you do anything wrong. You feel guilty before you disappoint anyone. You feel guilty simply for wanting something that is not useful to others. You feel guilty when you rest, guilty when you say no, guilty when you choose yourself. That guilt is not conscience, it's training. Nietzsche would call it a domestication of the will, because the strongest form of control is not punishment, it's internalized morality. When the person polices themselves, when the person becomes their own guard. And that's what you were doing. Not because you're stupid, because you were conditioned. Conditioned to equate goodness with safety. So goodness becomes survival. Not ethics, survival. And survival makes everything narrow. In survival, you don't choose what you want, you choose what keeps you accepted. So you become good, and your life becomes smaller. Now, there is a moment when you can see this clearly. It's when someone asks something of you that you don't want to do. Not something huge, something small, a favor, a message, a request for your time. And you feel the immediate impulse to refuse. You feel the honesty. Then something else appears, a second voice, a moral voice. It doesn't say, "Do you want to do this?" It says, "What kind of person refuses?" That's the mechanism. The question isn't about your desire, it's about your identity. What kind of person are you? And because you've built your identity on being good, you comply. You sacrifice your time, you sacrifice your mood, you sacrifice your inner life, and you call it kindness. But kindness without consent is not kindness, it's submission. And submission becomes exhaustion. Nietzsche would say, when a person cannot express their instincts outward, they turn them inward. When you cannot say no, your aggression has nowhere to go, so it goes inside. It becomes self-criticism. It becomes depression. It becomes fatigue. It becomes that dull heaviness you carry around like a permanent weather. This is why good people often feel secretly angry. Not because they're evil, because they are blocked. Their vitality has been moralized into obedience. And vitality doesn't disappear, it mutates. It becomes resentment. Resentment is what grows when you feel powerless but cannot admit it. When you feel used but cannot say it. When you feel unseen but cannot demand to be seen. So you keep being good. And inside, you begin to despise the people you keep helping. Not consciously, quietly. And then you hate yourself for feeling that way, because your moral identity forbids resentment. So you repress it. And repression is exhausting. Now you can start to see the loop. You suppress your instincts to be good. The suppression creates resentment. The resentment creates guilt. The guilt forces more goodness to compensate. The cycle drains you. This is not a personality flaw, it's a structure. And Nietzsche would say, the tragedy is that you call this structure virtue. You call it being a good person. But a good person who is drained is not good. They're controlled. They are living under values that convert life into obligation. Now, some people hearing this will immediately defend themselves. But I don't want to become selfish. But kindness matters. But society would collapse without good people. And Nietzsche would not argue with the importance of ethics. He would argue with the psychological cost of moral identities that are built on self-denial. Because there is a difference between choosing to be kind and needing to be kind to feel allowed to exist. One is strength.
The other is dependency. Dependency on approval. Dependency on being seen as good. Dependency on not being judged. And when your goodness is dependency, it is fragile, because it cannot tolerate misinterpretation. If someone thinks you're selfish, it breaks you. If someone is disappointed in you, you collapse. If someone withdraws approval, your nervous system panics. That panic is not evidence that you're immoral. It's evidence that your identity is externally regulated. You are still living under the gaze of an imagined audience, and the imagined audience has a verdict ready. Good people sacrifice. Good people endure. Good people don't demand. So you endure, and you become tired. And because you don't understand the moral mechanics of your tiredness, you try to solve it the wrong way. You take vacations that don't help. You do self-care that feels like chores. You try to manage stress. But you can't manage stress if the source is identity. Because the source is not workload. The source is self-erasure. The source is the invisible contract. I will be good, and in return, I will be loved. But love purchased through self-erasure is expensive. It costs your life. And here's the most disturbing part. Sometimes you don't even enjoy being good. You enjoy being needed. Because being needed is proof you have value. So you make yourself available. You become reliable. You become the person who responds, who fixes, who carries. And then you hate the people who come to you. But you can't blame them.
Because you trained them. Your availability taught them what access they have to you. So you remain trapped. Not by them, by the identity you built to survive. Nietzsche would say, this is how morality becomes a cage. Not a cage made of rules, a cage made of meanings. Meanings you inherited, meanings you never examined, meanings that tell you what you are. And the moment you consider stepping out of the cage, guilt appears like an alarm. So you retreat, you stay good, and you become tired again. Now at this point, most content would pivot into solutions. It would offer steps. It would tell you how to set boundaries. It would give you scripts to say no. But that's not what this channel does, because scripts don't change the structure. They just give you new ways to perform goodness. Even boundaries can become performances if they're built from fear. So instead, this video stays in revelation, because the revelation is the thing that actually changes you. You are not tired because you do too much. You are tired because you are living under a moral identity that punishes your instincts. And the proof is simple. If your tiredness were purely physical, rest would fix it. But your tiredness persists because it isn't physical. It's moral. It's the fatigue of being on trial all the time. Trial for wanting, trial for resting, trial for saying no, trial for being human. Nietzsche would call this a sick conscience, not because you lack morality, because morality has turned inward and become cruelty. Cruelty disguised as virtue. You can feel this cruelty in your internal language. Stop being so selfish. You're overreacting. Don't be difficult. Be mature. Be grateful. Be good. That is not kindness. That is domination. And the domination is happening inside you. Now notice what happens when you imagine a different life. Not a dramatic life, a small shift. You imagine not replying immediately. You imagine saying no without explaining. You imagine leaving without guilt. And immediately your mind produces consequences. They'll think I'm cold. They'll be disappointed. They'll leave. And behind those consequences is the primitive fear. If I'm not good,
I will be alone. So you choose exhaustion over loneliness, because exhaustion feels familiar. Loneliness feels like exile. And Nietzsche knew this. Becoming free feels like exile at first, because the moral community does not reward autonomy, it rewards compliance. So when you stop complying, you feel strange, not empowered, strange. Like you broke a law you can't name. That sensation is not proof you're wrong. It's proof the law existed. An invisible law. A law that says your worth is measured by how easy you are to have around. That law produces good people, and it produces tired people, and it produces resentment that no one talks about.
Now, there is a deeper layer here that many people avoid because it threatens their self-image. Some people use goodness not just for love, but for superiority. Not obvious superiority, moral superiority. They suffer quietly, and then they feel entitled. Entitled to being valued, entitled to being chosen, entitled to being repaid. And when repayment doesn't come, resentment becomes poison. Nietzsche called this a form of moral revenge. The person cannot demand directly, so they demand through guilt, through implication, through silent disappointment. They become the martyr. And martyrdom is another cage, because martyrdom keeps you dependent. It keeps you trapped in a narrative where your suffering proves your virtue. But virtue is not proven by suffering. Virtue is proven by choice. And when you are not choosing your goodness, it is not virtue. It is compulsion. This is why goodness drains you, because compulsion drains. Compulsion is the nervous system doing something it doesn't consent to over and over until it collapses. And that collapse often looks like apathy, numbness, irritability, sudden disappearance, a coldness you don't recognize in yourself. People call it burnout, but burnout is sometimes the psyche protecting itself from moral exploitation, a last refusal, not dramatic, quiet, a shutting down. And then you feel guilty again, because the system doesn't allow you to stop. Now, let's bring it back to the most important point. The goal of this video is not to make you reject goodness, it's to make you see what kind of goodness you're living under, because there are two kinds. One makes you stronger, the other makes you smaller. One is chosen, the other is imposed. One is generosity, the other is fear. And if you don't learn to tell the difference, you will spend your life tired, not from work, from self-erasure. So let's end where we began. You don't feel exhausted because life is hard. You feel exhausted because your identity is still controlled by the need to be seen as good. And Nietzsche would leave you with a question, not a solution, because a solution would let you escape the truth too quickly. So here is the question. When you say yes, is it kindness or is it fear of being judged? When you help, is it love or is it proof that you deserve a place? When you endure, is it strength or is it obedience disguised as virtue? And if you stopped being good for 1 week, not cruel, not destructive, just unavailable to guilt, who would you become, and what would finally be allowed to live in you? If this resonated, you're not the only one. Stay with the channel. Silence.